Hey guys, before Christmas we learned how to add and subtract fractions. So today we're going to walk back through those steps with you, and then we're going to do a little independent practice to see how well you're doing with those steps. The first thing I want to review with you is how to make equivalent fractions. Look at this first example. We have 4/6 and 6/8. And we want to find a common denominator so we can make equivalent fractions. The strategy we use for that is listing our common multiples. So I can list my multiples of 6 and my multiples of 8. So I would say 6, 12, 18, 24. And for 8, I could say 8, 16, 24. And my classes would be yelling at me to stop because now I have found a common denominator, right, my least common multiple, which is 24. So I know that I could make both my denominators a 24 now. And then I'm going to find the relationship between my old denominator and my new denominator. So what happens to 6 to make it a 24? Well, it would be 6 times 4. So then I would do the same thing to my numerator. 4 times 4 is 16. Then I'm going to go over to 6/8, and I'm going to say what happens to 8 to make it a 24. Well, 8 times 3 is 24, so 6 times 3 is 18. So now I have two equivalent fractions, 16/24 and 18/24, and I could either add or subtract those two fractions now. And let's look at 2/3 and 4/5. Let's do the same process. Find my multiples of 3 and 5. So 5, 10, 15, and again my kids will be yelling to stop. And 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. There we are, our common denominator, which is our least common multiple here. So I could make both of my new denominators 15. What happens to 3 to make it a 15? 3 times 5. So 2 times 5 is 10. And there's my new fraction there. And then 5 times 3 is 15. So 4 times 3 is 12. And now I have two fractions with common denominators that I could either add or subtract. And now we're ready to add fractions. So we've used the strategy PMF, and P stands for problem, M stands for multiples, and F stands for factors. So we have our problem set up, 4 3/8 plus 2 5/12. Now, I can't add 3/8 and 5/12 like they are because they do not have a common denominator. So I'm going to come over here and use my multiples column, and we are going to list our multiples of 8 and 12. So multiples of 8, multiples of 12. 8, 16, 24, and then my multiples of 12 would be 12 and 24, and there's my least common multiple, 24. So that's going to be my new denominator. So we need to find the relationship between the old denominator and the new denominator. So what happens to 8 to make it a 24? Well, 8 times 3 is 24. So I do the same thing to my numerator. 3 times 3 is 9. And then come down here, what happens to 12 to make it a 24? 12 times 2 is 24, so 5 times 2 is 10. Now that I have the same denominator, I can add my fractions. So I'm going to add my numerators. 9 plus 10 is 19, and I'm going to keep the same denominator. So I have 19/24. Now I can add my whole numbers. 4 plus 2 is 6. Now the last thing I want to check is if I need to use my factors column. Is my fraction 19/24 simplified? It is simplified because there is not a number that goes into 19 and 24. So my final answer is 6 and 19/24. And now let's subtract fractions. So again, we're going to use our PMF model to help us to organize all of our steps as we're subtracting. Now the subtracting can be a little more involved just because we have an element in there where we may have to regroup. So let's kind of work through this problem together. So we have 6 and 1/6 minus 2 and 6/8. So just like the adding, if we don't have the same denominator, we cannot subtract these two fractions. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to scoot over a little bit further this time. And I'm going to find my multiples of 6 and my multiples of 8. 6, 12, 18, 24, stop, and 8, 16, and 24. So there is my least common multiple, 24. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to rename my denominators as 24. So what happens to 6 to make it a 24? Well, 6 times 4 is 24, so 1 times 4 is 4. And then what happens to 8 to make it a 24? 8 times 3 is 24, so 6 times 3 is 18. And now that I have a common denominator, I'm ready to subtract. But what is my big problem here? Can I say 4 minus 18? No, I cannot do that. I cannot take 18 away from 4. So I have to regroup, just like we would with whole numbers. So to regroup, I'm going to come over to my whole number, and I'm going to borrow a whole number. And that's going to leave me with 5 wholes. I'm going to take that whole that I borrowed, and I'm going to come back over and add it into my 4 24ths. Now, if I already have a denominator of 24, then I'm going to use that same denominator to make my one whole. And to make one whole, we know it's a number over itself. So this 24 24ths is equal to the one whole that I took away from this 6. Now, I'm going to put these two fractions back together. I'm going to sandwich them back together. So 4 plus 24 is 28. Keep the same denominator. And now I'm able to come over here and subtract 18 24ths because I have the same denominator, and I can say 28 minus 18. That equals 10, and I'm going to keep the same denominator. Now, when I come back to my whole numbers, I'm now going to say 5 minus 2, which is 3. And my last step is to make sure that 10 24ths is simplified. So what goes into 10 and 24? Well, we know that 2 goes into 10 and 24 because they're both even. So I'm going to divide by 2 over 2. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. And 24 divided by 2 is 12. And I'm going to bring my whole number back over. And now we know that 3 and 5/12 is our final answer because there is nothing that goes into 5 and 12. So it is simplified.